Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. The disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled, and they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Thanks be to God.
Will you pray with me? Gracious God, the word you speak has power to create, power to disturb, power to heal. Help us to hear your word for us today. Amen. Jesus was trying to hide. He had heard about the way in which Herod was on a rampage, and in his rampage had arrested Jesus' cousin John the Baptist and whacked off his head. He had heard how the head of John the Baptist had been served up on a platter by Herod, given to the seductive Salome. And Jesus understood that if he was not very, very careful, his head was likely to be the next course in that gruesome dinner. And so he was trying to hide. But it isn't easy to hide when you are as popular as Jesus was at that particular time in his ministry. Somebody is always watching for you, and somebody always sees you. And the moment they see you, the word goes around, he's here. He's right here in our own neighborhood. But Jesus tried to hide. However, as you heard in our text for this morning, he was not successful. He had gone out to what Matthew describes as a lonely place, a deserted place, but it didn't seem to deter the crowds. Why? Because they were looking for something that would take away the monotony of their day-to-day life. They were looking for something that would bring hope, something that would bring meaning, something that would bring purpose to their lives. And they had seen a bit of that in Jesus. And so it didn't deter them that Jesus had gone out to a lonely place. They just followed him around the Sea of Galilee and went there with him. Nor did they make any real preparation for that journey around the around the Sea of Galilee. They didn't take any bread with them. They didn't take any water with them. They didn't take any bedrolls with them. Some of them, I think, did not even bother to tell their family where they were going. Without thinking about what they were doing, they just followed him out to that place where there was nothing but rock and sand and the heat of the sun. They went because they knew that he would be there. Nor were they disappointed when they found him. For as Matthew tells us in the text that Marva read for us this morning, when Jesus saw that crowd coming toward him, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus had compassion. And I don't suppose that there was anything the people in that crowd needed more than they needed the compassion of Jesus. Nor do I think there is anything that the suffering people of our world need more than they need the compassion of Jesus. And those of us who are gathered here this morning, who have felt something of the compassion of Jesus in our life, feel compelled to do something to help the suffering people of the world experience that compassion of Jesus, but we face a problem in doing it. And the problem is we can't figure out exactly how to do it. The world is so big, and the needs are so many, and our resources seem so limited to us. How are we to share the compassion of Jesus with the suffering people of the world? So I want this morning to remind you of something that you already know, but something that we so easily forget. And that is simply this, that one of the best ways we have available to us for sharing the compassion of Jesus with the suffering people of the world is to be found in the Week of Compassion offering that we are going to be taking in about 2 weeks here in this congregation. I'm talking to you about it this morning so you will be ready, because as Dan already spoke about a couple of other things this morning, this is one of the most important things the church does across the year, this Week of Compassion offering. Do you know why it's important? It's important because it allows us to take the same methods that Jesus used to show compassion to the crowd about which we read in our text and share that compassion with the suffering people of the world. For example, one of the ways in which Jesus showed his compassion for this crowd of which we heard this morning was to heal those in their midst who were sick. If we could see the suffering people of the world gathered together in a crowd as Jesus saw that crowd coming to him long ago, we would recognize how many of those suffering people in the world are sick, and I mean really sick, and who need the miracles that modern medicine can provide for them. If we could see that crowd, if we could see those people who are so sick, one of the things that we would see is a father walking down a mountainside, carrying in his arms his sick little boy. He's walking down the mountain path that leads to the camp that Week of Compassion workers have set up at the base of the mountain to bring medicine to those who are in need. Watching that man walk down that path carrying his sick little boy in his arms. Nobody knows how far he's had to walk in order to arrive at that camp. But when he did arrive at the camp, the little boy that he was carrying in his arms looked as if he might be a year old. But when the medical workers began to work with him, they discovered that in actuality he was 4 years old and suffering from acute malnutrition. Never in his life had that little boy tasted milk. His family was too impoverished to be able to buy milk if there'd been any available, which there wasn't. His mother was too malnourished to be able to provide the milk that her baby needed from her body. So the medical workers there in that week of compassion camp began to treat this little boy. They treated him with a course of vitamins and with milk, just a dropper full at first. You know how that goes, a little more as time went on. They treated him by giving him deworming medicine because they had discovered that he had a tapeworm that was siphoning off whatever little bit of nutrition he managed to receive. And bit by bit, ever so slowly, that little boy began to regain his health. When finally he was strong enough to be able to travel, when finally he was strong enough to be able to return with his father to his home before they left the camp, our Week of Compassion workers enrolled them in a program about which they knew that would provide for that family and others in the village where they lived the nutrition that they needed. And through those Week of Compassion workers, that little boy and quite a few other people in his village were given a new lease on life. Now make no mistake about this. Make no mistake about it. That scenario unfolded because people like you were generous in their giving to Week of Compassion, and thereby were able to continue the marvelous healing ministry of Jesus Christ and share the compassion of Christ with people who were in need. If you read about this text, you know that another way in which Jesus shared compassion with that crowd was by teaching the people who had come to him. They had come to learn from him, and he taught them how life could be different for them. And our Week of Compassion workers all over the suffering parts of the world have adopted that same technique, teaching people how life can be different, how life can be better for them. One of those who has been taught is a young woman by the name of Shali, who lives in a large city in India. She'd been living on the sidewalk, living in a big cardboard box with her children. Her husband had disappeared somewhere, and she was trying to raise her children, living in a box on the sidewalk in one of the large cities of India. One day, Shali was out at the city dump picking over a pile of garbage, trying to find food that her children could eat. And as she picked through that garbage, she was approached by a woman who worked for Week Compassion's Christian Development Center there in that city. The woman had been watching Shally out there picking through the garbage on that heap. She approached her and talked with her for a little bit about her situation and about her children and about her life. And then she said to Shally, "Have you ever thought about learning to sew so that you could buy food for your children?" Well, Shally had never dreamed that anything like that was possible for her. Her religion had taught her that it was her karma to live on the sidewalk and to get food for her children from the garbage of a higher class of people. But then came this woman in the name of Christ and told Shally that life could be different for her and told her how life might be different for her. And the next week, Shally was enrolled in the sewing course at the Christian Development Center. Her children were enrolled in the elementary school, the grade school, and were learning to read and write in that school that the Development Center sponsored. When Shally finished the sewing course, the Week of Compassion workers arranged for her to get a small loan with which she was able to buy a pedal sewing machine, like my grandmother used to have. A pedal sewing machine didn't require electricity, just a pedal machine. They provided for her an interest-free loan that enabled her to buy that machine and put it in the home where they had found a place for her to live with her children. They got Shally a contract with a clothing manufacturer, a garment manufacturer, to do piecework. And sometimes, most days as a matter of fact, Shally sews more than 40 pieces a day and is able to provide now food for her family. When Shally looks at her life, she cannot believe what has happened to her. She cannot believe that she was living a life with no hope. And then one day a woman came along and in the name of Christ said to her, "Life can be different for you. And here is how it can happen." And I want you to understand that you pay the salary of that woman who came and helped Shally. You and others like you who give to the Week of Compassion offering are keeping the compassionate teaching ministry of Jesus Christ alive. And then, of course, if you were paying attention to the text that was read this morning, you understand that one of the ways in which Jesus shared compassion with that crowd was to feed the hungry in their midst. As Janice pointed out in her time with the children, the disciples were not really in favor of doing that. They said to Jesus, "Send them away. Let them take care of themselves. How are we going to give them any food?" But Jesus was having none of it. Jesus, in no uncertain terms, said to his disciples, You give them something to eat. And in that way, showed them his compassion. And our Week of Compassion workers have adopted that same method. Jesus understood that his healing and teaching ministry would have no value whatsoever if he didn't first attend to the basic need of that crowd for food. And our Week of Compassion workers understand that as well. And so, not too awful long ago, when a famine was sweeping through one of the needy third world countries, our Week of Compassion workers went to that country and set up food stations all across the country. And anybody who needed it, anybody who wanted it, without being asked, what's your religion? Without being asked, do you believe? Without being asked, will you become a follower of Jesus? None of that. Just, if you need it and you want it, you can come every day to this food station at noon and get a bowl of hot cereal. One of those who came was a woman by the name of Janie Bai. And Janie came every day at noon to that feeding station where she received that hot bowl of cereal. And for her, for months on end, it was the only meal she had each day. That food was there, is there, because you have given to the Week of Compassion. And this woman named Janie Bai feels very strongly about what you have done for her. And she has written a little piece of poetry about that bowl of mush that she receives each day at noon. And I want to share it with you today. She says, every noon at 12 in the blazing heat, God comes to me in the form of 200 grams of gruel. I know God in every grain. I taste God in every lick. I commune with God as I gulp, for God keeps me alive with 200 grams of gruel. Will you pray with me? In your compassion, gracious God, you hear the cry of the poor, the needy, and the lonely. May we too hear the cries of our brothers and sisters, responding in love, as you have shown us in your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.